only mode.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyle Bell, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator here at Farm Credit East. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few technology tips to keep in mind while viewing today's webinar. All attendees are muted throughout the presentation. Once in a while, it's a good idea to tap your mouse so your screen does not go to sleep during the presentation. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Questions can be text chatted in at any point. To send in your question, click on the red arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to expand the GoToWebinar control panel. That'll display the text box where you can type in your questions. A recording of today's webinar as well as presentation materials will be available at farmcrediteast.com/webinars for access after the webinar. Today's webinar, the USDA Coronavirus Food Assistance Program Part 2, or CFAP 2, What Specialty Crop Producers Should Know, is brought to you by USDA and the Farm Service Agency, as well as co-sponsored by us here at Farm Credit East. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided in this webinar is not intended to be an investment, tax, or legal advice and should be used and should not be applied on by any recipients for such purposes. Farm Credit East does not make any representation or warranty regarding the content and disclaims any responsibility for the information, materials, third-party opinions, and data included in this webinar. So basically, this is our best interpretation, as well as we have industry experts with us to present this information. And as I said, a recording of today's webinar will be available at Farm Credit East/webinars after the presentation today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Craig and Sarah with USDA Farm Service Agency for the presentation today. Sarah, you should have be able to get control of the screen now.
All right. Okay, so good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I am Sarah Fournier. I'm a program specialist in Connecticut Farm Service Agency. Today, as Kyle mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP 2. I'm going to get things started this morning with some general program and producer eligibility information. So due to the continued impacts the coronavirus has had on agricultural producers through market disruptions and associated marketing costs, the USDA implemented a second round of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, also known as CFAP 2, on September 21st. CFAP 2 builds on assistance provided to producers through CFAP 1 and provides eligible producers with financial assistance to help absorb some of the increased marketing costs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. This program is designed to offset payment losses and the financial impacts of the pandemic. Most of the producers applying have incurred significant costs to get a product ready for market and then either couldn't sell the product or experienced a price decline. CFAP 2 payments aren't expected to make producers whole or compensate them for all of their losses, but it is designed to give producers some financial relief. If a producer has outstanding debts with the USDA, they should still apply for the program if they're eligible, because their payments will not be withheld to satisfy any USDA debts or Treasury debts. Agricultural operations impacted by the pandemic since April of 2020 are encouraged to apply for CFAP 2. Also, many more commodities are eligible under CFAP 2 that weren't eligible through CFAP 1, and it's important to note that participation in CFAP 1 isn't a requirement to participate in CFAP 2. Up to an additional $14 billion was announced in the second Coronavirus Food Assistance Program for agricultural producers who continue to face the market disruptions and associated marketing costs because of COVID-19. Most CFAP2 payments will be paid out of the CCC Charter Act funds. However, if you grow and sell tobacco, payments specific to tobacco sales will be made using the remaining funds from the CARES Act. As I mentioned a moment ago, sign up for CFAP2 began on September 21st. To file an application timely, you'll want to complete the CFAP2 applications and get them submitted to the county office by December 11th of 2020. So who's eligible to apply for CFAP2? It's producers who are in the business of farming at the time of the application and who have a risk in the production of eligible commodities that fall into any of these three categories. You have the price trigger commodities, which includes dairy, livestock, broilers and eggs, barley, corn, sorghum, soybeans, sunflowers, upland cotton, and wheat. And these commodities experienced a 5% or greater market price decline between the average for mid-January of 2020 in comparison to the average from late July of 2020. Then there's the flat rate crops. These are acreage-based non-specialty crops such as alfalfa, hemp, oats, rye, etc., that either didn't meet the 5% price decline trigger or they didn't have data available to calculate a price change. And the last category is specialty or sales-based commodities. And the focus of today's presentation is on sales-based commodities. And since we're going to be reviewing that in depth in a little bit, I'm not going to get into that just right now. So now let's take a look at the specifics of producer and payment eligibility. An eligible producer is a person or legal entity who shares in the risk of producing a commodity and is in the business of farming at the time of application. Contract growers are not eligible for CFAP2. Contract growers typically own the facility, but they don't own the commodity, meaning they don't have a risk in that commodity. This is different from a producer who has a contract to sell a commodity they own to another party. Producers of this kind would not be considered contract growers. Producers no longer in the business of farming at the time of application are not eligible for CFAP2. Whether you applied for CFAP1 or not, you can still apply for CFAP2. If you previously applied for and received a payment through CFAP1, this doesn't affect your eligibility to receive a payment through CFAP2. New producers that may not have historical sales records can also apply. We'll look into that more later on once we get into the sales commodities. And to be eligible for CFAP2, individuals and entities must have an average adjusted gross income of less than $900,000 for tax years 2016, 2017, and 2018, or have derived at least 75% of their adjusted gross income from farming, ranching, or forestry-related activities. They must also commercially produce the eligible commodities, comply with the provisions of the highly erodible land and wetland conservation regulations, and those are often called the conservation compliance provisions. They must not have a controlled substance violation, and if they're a foreign person or entity, they must provide land, capital, and a substantial amount of active personal labor to the farming operation. Now, when it comes to payment limitations for this program, the total amount of CFAP2 payments across all eligible commodities that a person or legal entity may receive, excluding joint operations, is $250,000. Payments to a program applicant that is a joint operation cannot exceed $250,000 per person or legal entity that make up the first level of ownership in the joint operation, unless the first level member is another joint operation. Joint operations include general partnerships and joint ventures. Payments made directly or indirectly to a person or legal entity will be combined and limited to the per person or per legal entity. Additionally, the CFAP 2 payment limitation is separate from the CFAP 1 payment limitation. As a note, 2020 is considered the program year for determining payment limitation and payment eligibility, despite some of the categories using 2019 sales or production. Unlike other FSA programs, special payment limitation rules apply to CFAP 2 participants that are corporations, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, trusts, and estates. Authorized representatives of legal entities may seek an increase in the $250,000 payment limitation based on the members, stockholders, partners, beneficiaries, or heirs' contribution of active personal labor, active personal management, or combination thereof to the entity. These legal entities may receive up to $500,000 if 2 members each contribute at least 400 hours of active personal labor or management, or up to a maximum of $750,000 if 3 members each contribute at least 400 hours of active personal labor or active personal management. CFAP 2 payments to corporations, LLCs, limited partnerships, trusts, and estates that qualify for the increased payment limitation will be limited to the lesser of the increased payment limitation or the sum of the amount each eligible member, stockholder, partner, heir, or beneficiary of the legal entity may receive regardless of their ownership share. Payments to a legal entity may be reduced if any member has received prior CFAP 2 payments through another farming operation or is otherwise ineligible for CFAP benefits. As you may have noticed on the previous slide, trusts and estates were highlighted. This is because the optional increase in payment limitation was expanded to include trusts and estates both for CFAP 1 and for CFAP 2. Since trusts and estates weren't originally included in the payment limitation increase under CFAP 1, FSA is affording trusts and estates the opportunity to revise timely filed or approved late filed CFAP 1 applications to identify individual persons who are heirs or beneficiaries who contribute 400 or more hours of active personal labor or active personal management. County committees will review and approve or disapprove CFAP 1 applications revised to include the trusts or estates. So to recap quickly, for individual CFAP 2 applicants, legal entities with a sole member or multi-member legal entities where no members or only one member contributes 400 or more hours of active personal labor or active personal management, the payment limitation can't be increased and will remain at that $250,000. For legal entities with 2 or more members, the payment limit for the entity may be increased to $500,000 if at least 2 members contribute 400 or more hours of active personal labor, active personal management, or combination thereof with respect to the operation of that entity. And for legal entities with 3 or more members, the limit may be increased to $750,000 if at least 3 members contribute 400 hours or more of active personal labor, active personal management, or combination thereof with respect to the operation of that entity. Software is currently being developed to apply new rules for attribution for the legal entities qualifying for the optional increased payment limitation for both CFAP 1 and CFAP 2. This software should be available later this year. Until the revised attribution software is available, CFAP 2 payments will continue to be issued, limited, and attributed as originally released under CFAP 1. Once the software has been updated, an additional disbursement will be issued. On the next two slides, I'll be reviewing an example of how payment limitation and attribution rules are currently being applied to entities that qualify for the increased payment limitation, as well as how the payment limitation and attribution calculation will change once the updated software is available. So under CFAP 1, the increased payment limitation was calculated based on a member's ownership share of a legal entity. So in this example, ABC Corporation's payment limitation is increased to $500,000 based on two members contributing labor or management. Member 1 has 90% ownership share of the corporation, and their maximum payment limitation is $250,000. While the overall limitation for the corporation was increased to $500,000, Member 1's payment share would be capped at $250,000. Member 2 has a 10% ownership share of the corporation. Their maximum payment limitation is also $250,000. However, because their ownership share of the corporation was only 10%, they would only be eligible to receive a maximum of $50,000 through this corporation. And that's because that's the $500,000 total limitation times the 10% share. So the total payment to ABC Corporation in this example would be $300,000. So that's the combination of Member 1's total limitation of $250,000 and Member 2's 10%, $50,000. It's important to note that payments could be reduced further if they receive payments through other farming operations or if they've run into any other issues with their eligibility, such as being AGI non-compliant. Under CFAP 2 and now expanded to CFAP 1, each member that is eligible for the increased payment limitation will be eligible to receive directly or indirectly up to $250,000 regardless of their ownership share of an entity. So in this example, ABC Corporation's payment limitation once again is increased to $500,000 based on two members contributing labor or management. The shares are the same as with the last example. So Member 1 holds 90% ownership share of the corporation with a maximum payment limitation of $250,000, and Member 2 holds 10% ownership share of the corporation with a maximum payment limitation of $250,000. The difference here, though, is that each eligible member can receive directly or indirectly up to the $250,000. So the sum of payments each eligible member may receive is $500,000 regardless of their ownership share. So the total payment to ABC Corporation in this example would be the $500,000. Moving on from payment limitations, to be eligible for a payment, a person or legal entity, including their members, stockholders, or partners for legal entities, must have an average adjusted gross income, or AGI, for program year 2020 that does not exceed $900,000. The three base years used to compute the 2020 average AGI are tax years 2016, 2017, and 2018. To determine the 2020 AGI, all CFAP 2 applicants, including members of entities, must complete Form CCC 941. Applicants who exceed the $900,000 AGI limitation may still be determined eligible to receive CFAP 2 payments if at least 75% of the person's or legal entities' average AGI is derived from farming, ranching, or forestry operations. In these instances, applicants must complete Form CCC 942 and obtain a certification from a licensed CPA or attorney verifying that 75% of the AGI is derived from farming, ranching, or forestry operations. So with all of that information, how do you apply? If you are a new customer to USDA, your local FSA county office staff will work with you to get your customer records established, eligibility documentation submitted, and they'll assist you with understanding what information needs to be included on your CFAP2 application. Some of the things you can expect to be asked for are the name, address, and tax ID of the CFAP2 applicant. If the applicant is an entity, you'll also be asked to provide this information for each member of the entity, including for any embedded entities. You'll also be asked for the farm operating structure, the adjusted gross income compliance certification to ensure eligibility, and direct deposit information, which enables payment. If you received a payment under CFAP1, your office likely already has this information on file, but it's worth double checking with them. To note, you don't need to have a farm number to apply for CFAP2 unless you will be filing an application for commodities identified as acreage-based crops. Multiple options are available to apply for CFAP2, including an online portal and payment calculator with a downloadable application generator. You can submit your application via mail, fax, and delivery, or electronically. FSA staff at your local USDA service center are happy to work with you, and they're there to help. All USDA service centers are open for business by phone. Some offices are open to visitors to conduct business in person by appointment only. All producers wishing to conduct business with FSA should call ahead and schedule an appointment. Service centers that are open for appointments will pre-screen visitors based on health concerns or recent travel, and visitors must adhere to social distancing guidelines. Visitors are also required to wear a face covering during their appointment. The CFAP2 application and any necessary forms are available on our website. That's farmers.gov/CFAP. And if you're unfamiliar with where your nearest service center is located, or if you want a point of contact for more information or to ask further questions after this meeting, you can find that information at farmers.gov/service center locator. Where multiple offices are listed, you'll want to make sure you're pulling the contact information for your local farm service agency office. Please note that these websites, they work best when using Chrome, Edge, or Safari web browsers. Whether you're applying online or through your local office, these are some of the forms you may be asked to complete when you enroll in CFAP2. So you have the AD 3117, which is the CFAP2 application. You'll file the CCC 902, only parts A and B, and that's the farm operating plan for payment eligibility. And if it's applicable, you'll file the CCC 901 for member information for legal entities. Additionally, there is the CCC 941 for the average adjusted gross income certification, the CCC 942 for the certification of income for farming, ranching, and forestry operations, and that's only if you did not meet the $900,000 for the AGI. And the AD 1026, which is for highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation certifications. When applying for CFAP2, Only one application needs to be submitted per producer. The application should include all eligible CFAP commodities that the applicant has an ownership share interest in nationwide. CFAP 2 is a self-certification program. Documentation is only required upon spot check or when requested by the county committee to support a producer's certification of their eligible commodities. Once an application is submitted, producers will have 60 days from the date the CFAP 2 application was signed to file all eligibility documents or to resolve any eligibility issues with their local FSA county office. Here's an example of the AD 3117 or CFAP 2 application. This is a 2-page application form. Part A is the producer agreement. This section outlines all of the things a producer is agreeing to when they sign the application. Part B is the producer information. This will be the name and address of the person or legal entity who had an ownership risk in an eligible commodity and was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Part C and D apply to dairy production and eggs and broiler production. Since these sections are not applicable to sales commodities, we won't be reviewing them today. And here we have the second page of the AD 3117. Part E is for livestock inventory and Part G is for the acreage-based crops. Again, like Part C and D from the first page, these sections aren't applicable to sales commodities and won't be reviewed today. Part F, however, of the AD 3117 will be where the sales information is going to be loaded for specialty or sales-based commodities. Part H is where applicants will request the optional increased payment limitation for the corporations, LLCs, limited partnerships, trusts, and estates. And lastly, Part I is the producer certification where applicants will sign and date the form. And then as some general payment provisions, administrative offset does not apply to CFAP 2. Assignments of payments are available upon request. CFAP 2 is not a first-come, first-served program. National Office doesn't anticipate any funding deficiencies, and payments are not factored, nor are they subject to sequestration. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Craig to review your sales commodities.
Thanks, Sarah. This is Craig Christo. I'm a program specialist in the New Jersey State Office, and I will be covering the specifics of the sales commodity section, which, as Sarah mentioned, is one of 5 categories that we have for the program overall. I'll start out with just a brief overview of the different subcategories as well as how the certification works, and then move into some more details and examples that might be helpful to understand how this all works. So the sales commodity category is really broken down into 6 different subcategories, which you may have seen listed on the application form. The first one is aquaculture, which includes mollusks. The second group is what are considered specialty crops, and these were determined by another USDA agency called AMS, or the Agricultural Marketing Service, and they provide a list which is available on our farmers.gov site, which you see the link for here, and that was also provided on a previous slide that Sarah had. And you can find every eligible specialty crop listed on there. There are quite a few of them, and they consist largely of non-traditional ag crops like fruit and vegetables, herbs, honey, maple sap, and a multitude of other ones. The third subcategory are nursery crops and floriculture. Additionally, there is another category that is being called other livestock, And this is the livestock listed below here, including things like, at least in New Jersey, we have a fair amount of like alpaca, bison, quail, turkeys, goats, and the rest that you can see there. And these are those animals that are grown for food, fiber, fur, or feathers. The fifth category is kind of a catch-all where at the will of the secretary, they had the option of adding various different commodities that may not have been included originally. And they only include right now, and there's no anticipation of added commodities at this point, but what has been included in here are Christmas trees, goat milk, mohair, mink, including pelts, and wool. The final category is tobacco, which I don't think we have much of up here in the Northeast, but that is the sixth subcategory within this sales commodity area. So the sales commodity certification works differently than all of the other sections of the form of the application, all of the other different commodity groups that we have, and that for the most part, those are some sort of payment rate per acre or per animal or that sort of thing. But the way that the certification for sales commodities works is that the producers will provide a self-certification of their eligible 2019 sales. So this is strictly how much money was made through the eligible commodities that are in this category. Note, and I want to point this out because it's very important that this is 2019, even though coronavirus was not really an issue in 2019, the decision was made to use 2019 sales in order to capture a full year of sales and to not have less potential payment in the end. And another important thing to point out about this is that it's based on the actual sales in the 2019 calendar year. So sales that are made in that year and would, for example, end up on your 2019 tax return. And this is regardless of what year the commodity was actually produced. So there would most likely be a fair amount of crop from 2018 that was sold in 2019 calendar year, and that would fall into being eligible for this category. On the other side of that, 2019 crops that weren't sold until 2020 would not be included. This is strictly sales made within that calendar year. The term up here at the top is the 2019 eligible sales, and how we define eligible sales is the following. This is a very important thing to keep in mind, especially for the types of operations that we tend to have in the Northeast, and that includes sales of raw commodities grown by the producer, any portion of the sales derived from adding value to the commodity, such as processing or packaging, or from sales of products purchased for resale, cannot be included in the amount of sales that are certified. And I'll have some examples of different things that might need to be reduced from a certification based on value added a few slides from now. Like Sarah mentioned, this is a self-certification program. We do not require supporting documentation of the sales that are being certified to in this category or on anything else that is on the application, unless the producer's selected for spot check, which would happen a little bit down the road after payments are made and everything, or if requested by the county committee, which would be based on some sort of questioning of the reasonableness of the application or what is certified on there. If that were to occur, this slide shows a list of the types of things that the applicant may use to support their certification and what they would also use to calculate what their certification would be. So this could be a Schedule F from a tax return, sales receipts, other sales documents, if there is a forward price commodity, ledgers of income, income statements of deposit slips, register tapes, and the number of other ones on here that I won't read all of them to you, but it's all fairly standard types of things that you would get as a producer when you sell your crop. All right, now to jump into more of the specifics of each of the areas, to start with aquaculture. And aquaculture, for the purpose of this program, is defined as any species of aquatic organisms grown as food for human consumption, fish raised as feed for fish that are consumed by humans, and ornamental fish propagated and reared in an aquatic medium. So what this would include would be things like farm-raised tilapia or trout, or ornamental fish like koi. Also, the eligible aquaculture species must be raised in a commercial operation and in water in a controlled environment. Now, I'll discuss the concept of controlled environment a little bit here because it applies to aquaculture as well as to nursery, which we'll discuss a couple of slides from now. And the definition for this program is pretty broad and really comes down to an industry standard of, do you have control of the production of the crop? So it doesn't, when we think of controlled environment, a lot of times you may think of like a greenhouse operation that has oxygen control and things like that. But it's not that specific for this. And it could include simply the control of the water, for example, for aquaculture through a lease. This category includes sales of all stages of mollusk. This was a clarification that was made by National Office a little bit after the beginning of the program, actually. And these would include, for example, seed oyster sales. So it doesn't have to be mollusks that are sold directly for human consumption, but they could be sold to another grower in order to bring them to full maturity. The specialty crops section is the next one. So as I mentioned before, there are a lot of different crops on the list that is on the farmers.gov site, and it's roughly 230 of them. It includes some of the more popular ones that we have in New Jersey anyway, such as what I have listed here: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, all sorts of melons, apples, peaches, blueberries, cranberries, grapes, most greens varieties and herbs, cabbage, broccoli, eggplant, sweet corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, honey, and a number of other ones. One thing to keep in mind here is that these are specialty crops, not just crops overall, even though that's what the heading on the form is. So it does not include any of the 32 crops that Sarah mentioned earlier that are included in the acreage-based category, which are the traditional ag crops like corn, soybeans, and things like that. So those are important. That's an important thing to remember, in that when a producer makes a certification, if they have specialty crops and normal traditional acreage-based crops, and they're certifying sales commodities, they have to remember to reduce any sales of corn or soybeans or anything from that. The certification cannot include, for these crops, resale of products, value added to a raw product through processing, branding, or special packaging, or agritourism type of activities like hay rides and that sort of thing. Next category is nursery and floriculture. The definitions of these two items are floriculture being cut flowers and cut greenery from annual and perennial flowering plants grown in a container or controlled environment for commercial sale. For nursery, it's decorative or non-decorative plants grown in a container or controlled environment for commercial sale. So again, these both use the controlled environment terminology, but it is, again, a relatively broad definition in that, for example, if you have sunflowers or something grown out in the field, they can be considered to be controlled environment if they meet the industry standards, like maybe they have irrigation and certain cultural management practices. It does not have to be within a greenhouse controlled environment of that nature. And just like with the crop section, it cannot include the dollar amount of sales considered to be value added. Fourth category is other livestock. This category includes sales of eligible live animals and their byproducts from that list that I had at the beginning of that, things like bison, turkeys, and goats. So the byproducts, for example, would include things like fleece or wool from alpaca eggs, milk, or anything like that that is harvested from the animal and sold as one of those 4 terms that were used at the beginning: food, fur, fiber, or feathers. What is not eligible, however, under this category would be products from dead animals, such as meat or hide, for example, from bison or goat. You may sell goat meat or turkey meat or things like that. Also, products that are processed or have value added. So just to expand a little bit on the meat part of this and the ineligibility of dead animals, the way that the certification for this would work would be that you could certify to the value of the live animals would have prior to being processed into meat or hide. So if you have 10 bison that you slaughter for meat, but you sell the meat, you would be eligible for the value that the live bison would have if you sold them to a processing company. However, not for the value added that would come from processing into meat. Also not eligible for CFAP 2 under the other livestock category would be any animals that are sold as breeding stock, any equine animals, any companion or comfort animals or pets, livestock produced by contract growers, or livestock raised for hunting, game, or guide purposes. Here are a few examples that address the concept of value added for this and how a producer would be able to certify to their sales by reducing their gross sales by whatever value added there may be to that final sale. So an ineligible sale that to be included on an application would be the sales of apple cider, because that's a processed product. However, what would be eligible would be the value of the apples that are grown and either sold or used to make that cider. Next example would, and it's similar, would be wine. So wine sales would not be eligible. However, because grapes are an eligible commodity, the value of the grapes that are grown and sold or used for wine would be eligible. So there could be some sort of reduction needed to be made there from a final sale of wine. For the third example, ineligible would be the full value of a flavor-infused honey with branded bottling or labeling. Eligible, however, would be the value of the raw honey and the basic bottling for sale as a raw product, as long as that bottling does not add value. So through branding or repackaging that may add value to what you would receive for the raw honey in bulk. The fourth example that we have is about alpacas. So ineligible would be any alpaca that is sold as breeding stock and the full value of any yarn that is derived from alpaca fleece. So, but however, eligible would be sales of any non-breeding alpaca and also the value of the wool or fleece that is harvested from the alpaca and used in the creation and sale of the yarn. So I mentioned before that we are basing this on 2019 sales of these commodities. One exception to that is the new producer rule. And the way this works is that producers who began farming sales commodities in 2020 and had no sales whatsoever in 2019 are allowed to self-certify to actual 2020 sales at the time of application in lieu of 2019 sales, since they did not have any. And just like a normal 2019 producer certification, the sales must be determined to be reasonable by the Farm Service Agency's county committees. The way that payments work for sales commodities is that, like I said before, the producer makes a certification in dollars of the total eligible sales in calendar year 2019. Again, the year of the production doesn't matter. It's the year of the sale. And then the agency has come up with a 5 payment gradation bracket to use in order to determine what the actual final payment is. And we see that here. So the sales range and payment factors in the following table are used to calculate payments. Now, I'll have an example of this in a moment that will hopefully make it a little more clear. So any sales up to $49,999 are paid at a payment factor of 10.6%. Then once we get above 49,999 up to 99,999, sales in that bracket would be paid at 9.9%. Third bracket is 100,000 up to 499,999, and that's a slightly lower payment factor of 9.7. From 500,000 to 999,999 is a 9% payment factor, and then any sales above $1 million is 8.8%. And here's a simple example of how this may work. Farmer A has 2019 sales of $75,000 total, and because of that, two payment factors would apply. We first apply the 10.6% payment factor to the first $49,999 of that certification, and then the additional $25,001 that brings it up to $75,000 would have the 9.9% factor applied. So here's the math down here at the bottom that shows Farmer A's gross payment would be the sum of 49,999 times 10.6, which is 52,9989, plus the 25,001 times the 9.9% factor, which is 24,7510. Add those two together, and that would give the total payment of $7,774.99. So I believe that is all I had for the sales commodities.
Okay, so we will go ahead and answer some questions that came in throughout the presentation. So the first one's just kind of a basic question is, what if you're a fiscal year? How do you go by, or do you go by that, or do you convert to calendar year?
Well, for the FSA requirement for the sales commodity is that the certification is for the calendar year of 2019. I would probably have to double check to remember exactly how that was determined to be altered potentially for people who have fiscal years that are different than the calendar year.
Okay. Sarah, this is from your part of the presentation. Can you elaborate a little bit on how the AGI is determined? Is it more of a top-line gross revenue or business expenses deducted?
So the AGI looks at the adjusted gross income for an entire entity. Let's see. So these end up getting submitted to IRS for determination. I'm sorry. There's feedback, so it's kind of distracting. I'm sorry, I don't know if I fully answered that question.
I think we did. So the next one is the online portal open to sole proprietors as well as incorporated entities? I think you may have covered that a little bit.
So I believe individuals can apply through the online portal. Craig, do you recall if that was opened up to entities as well?
Yeah, the online portal at this time allows only applications by individuals or general partnerships or the types of entities that cannot apply for the increased payment limitation. So LLCs and things like that cannot apply through the online portal, but other types of entities could. But the thing to remember about that is there's a process that somebody has to go to in order to attach their individual ID to an entity. So they would have to contact an office first in order to make that happen, which would allow them then to file an application through the online portal.
Okay. So a little bit more along the lines of the online portal and application. Is the December 11th deadline, is that the deadline to begin an application, or must all required documents also be submitted by that date?
So that's the date to get the actual application submitted to your county office. All of the other documentation, so the AGI forms, the 1026, all the eligibility documentation, you have 60 days from the date you sign an application to return that to the office. So that if you submitted and signed an application on December 11th, you would have 60 days from that date to submit any remaining documentation to the office.
Okay, great. So Craig, here's a question for you. I think you covered a little bit, but if you could go into a little bit more detail. So this person has a greenhouse. Only crops I grow for myself are counted for CFAP 2. How is the value determined? Is the value that I actually sold the crops for, or whether they were sold at retail or the wholesale price?
We really don't make a distinction between retail versus wholesale price. The only restriction that we have is regarding value added. So if you have a nursery product that you grow in a greenhouse, if there is something that is done to it in order to add value to what that crop would be, normally, just without. For example, if it's like a flower arrangement or something that you put together that could add value when it's sold at retail, then that would have to be reduced. But in general, whatever the sale value is minus any value added to it for sale is what would have to be deducted. Does that largely cover that question?
I think it does. So kind of along the same lines, with kind of the eligibility and kind of value added, they have a pick your own orchard. So they're selling apples, but is that considered agritourism? And how do they determine the value of the crop that they're claiming? Is it kind of that what they would have sold it for to a wholesaler or something of that nature?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. That's the basic idea. To go back to the agritourism thing, I mentioned that as ineligible. That doesn't mean that an apple that is sold or a pumpkin that is sold through an agritourism operation, you pay so much money to go pick a pumpkin or whatever. That doesn't automatically make it ineligible. But like you said with the apples, you wouldn't necessarily get all of the value that was part of that. It would only be what the value of the apples or the pumpkin would be if you sold it on its own at a normal market price. And that's something, it's really kind of up to the producer to make that determination of what the value would be. If it were to be spot checked down the road, really what FSA would be looking for would be, one, some sort of documentation as to what the actual sales value was, and then some kind of explanation to show how the producer derived what the certification value then became, how they made the reduction.
So this is kind of just a broad question for both of you. What if a producer has a complicated situation in their minds? How do they get help? Do they just look up their local FSA county office, or is there kind of going through the portal of farmers.gov, or what's the best route for them to kind of seek guidance if their situation is they think is kind of complicated?
Yeah, I would say, and Sarah, feel free to chime in on this too. To me, the best option is always to find their county office and talk to them, because the people at the office will have the knowledge and ability to explain to them what the eligibility rules are. We won't be able to tell them what to certify to, of course, but they would be able to guide them. There is information that on the farmers.gov site that could be helpful, but it's not, doesn't always have all of the detail that you would get from contacting the county office. We also have a call center that has been set up. It's a 1-800 number that is available on the farmers.gov site. So if you can't get a hold of your local office or don't know how to get a hold of them, you can call that number too.
So we have a couple more questions here. How does a producer that sells a CSA, a community supported agriculture program, how do they claim those type of crops?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Really, for this area, particularly the Northeast, I'm familiar with New Jersey more, but I think we're pretty similar, that we have a lot of things like CSAs or people who sell at farm stands and have a lot of value added products that they have, or UPIC operations or things like that. And the concept that has to be kept in mind when certifying to that is that we're looking at the value of the raw crop. So I guess a suggestion that I would make potentially for CSA would be to know how much of a certain crop was distributed, and then come up with a average market value of that crop and apply that to how much was sold. That would seem like kind of a logical way to do that.
And to add on to that, for CSAs or any other producer, if you've bought in any of your product and then are reselling it, just make sure that's not being included. So these are commodities and crops that you're growing and selling directly. So it's the first point of sale, basically. So if you had to buy in extra squash or something to fill out a CSA box, you wouldn't be claiming the sales for that bought in product.
So we have one other question here. How do you, for the value of, say, an unprocessed product like juice or maple sap, how is the best way to determine the value of that unprocessed product that you more or less have to process to determine the value?
I'll address the maple sap one first. I guess this is really referring to maple syrup. So to the eligible commodity is maple sap. So if you have a bunch of maple syrup, we do actually have that can be provided to a producer to convert that back to what the value of the maple sap would be. But with other crops, it's a little more complicated. There are resources out there that can be used, like NASS, the National Ag Statistics Survey, publishes prices and values for crops that can be used to help somebody, if they have processed all of their apples into cider and sold it that way, but they know how many apples they had and they need what the price of an apple would be, they can go to those resources. Also, the local extensions may have information on that as well.
Okay. So that is all the questions that we have for you, Craig and Sarah. I do want to offer our sincere thank you for providing this information to Northeast producers, foresters, and commercial fishermen. This is a great program that we hope will serve them well. Just as a reminder to everybody, there will be a recording of this, as well as the presentation will be available at farmcrediteast.com/webinars after this webinar has concluded. Sarah and Craig, again, thank you. Is there any final comments before we wrap up here today?
None for me, but thank you very much for having us.
Yes, same. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks to everyone.
With that, we are adjourned, and we hope everybody has a great Friday afternoon.